topic today is raising the question of how we should view the relationship between an Aristotelian approach to the study of living things and a Darwinian approach to the study of living things. Before I get into the details of that topic, I just want to say a little bit about my research and how this topic sort of rose to the level of something I actually wanted to do some serious thinking about. As Don mentioned, I'm, for the past, 50 years, if you include my graduate work, I've been thinking about the history and philosophy of biology. I've been thinking in particular about two topics that might seem rather unrelated to you. One of them is understanding Charles Darwin and understanding his impact on the science of biology and how his thinking, his approach to the study of living things changed the science of biology. I've also been, at the same time, and perhaps somewhat more intensely, involved in the study of Aristotle, and in particular, his philosophy and the relationship between his philosophy, especially his philosophy of science, and his actual scientific practice. Pick up a textbook in almost any area of science, and it's likely that the first chapter will say, well, the first person to actually study this science seriously was Aristotle. It's amazing how many different subject matters you'll find textbooks saying something about that. And you might think those two things are very distantly related, if related at all. After all, these two men lived about 2,300 years apart. They were living in totally different cultures. How could there possibly be anything interesting to say about how they're related? My approach, and the reason why these two people are very closely related in my way of thinking, is there's one question that's dominated my intellectual life, actually even before I explicitly recognized it as such, and that is, how does a person's philosophical outlook, his philosophical premises, change or determine the way in which that person thinks about how to investigate living things, think about life? And one way to think about Aristotle and Darwin is that the Aristotelian approach really dominated the study of living things really until the early modern period. I would think I'll say something about how things change in the 17th century and 18th century. But the most fundamental change in the history of science after the impact of Aristotle and its revival during the Renaissance is the impact of Charles Darwin on biology. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so the fact that those are the two areas that I've worked in means that in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, I was asked to do the entry on Aristotle's biology, and I was also asked to do the entry on Darwinism. And so it's not surprising that people often ask me, how are these two areas of your research related to one another? They seem so disparate and distant. And I kind of demurred for a large part of my career to give an answer to that question because I found it a very difficult question to answer objectively. But after thinking about it deeply, especially in the last 10 years or so, I did come to think of it as question that really did need to be answered. But it was made difficult to answer because, as I say here, there's a number of prominent philosophers and biologists who have argued that Aristotle was a primary roadblock to advance in the biological sciences, and that until that roadblock was removed, Darwinism and evolutionary thinking in general was impossible. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Two caveats. You're going to hear, if you're expected to hear a lot about evolution today, because I'm talking about Charles Darwin, you're not going to hear very much about evolution. A little bit at the end of the talk. But one of my themes today is that you need to get over the idea that thinking about living things in an Aristotelian way is a roadblock to evolutionary thinking. One other caveat. There's an equally misunderstood relationship between Aristotle and Darwin about teleology and teleological explanation. And I'm not avoiding that because I don't have anything to say about it. I'm avoiding that because I have way too much to say about it. That would be the subject of an entire different talk. If you were at the OCON in 2017, I gave 2 lectures on the history of teleology and said something about the differences and similarities between Aristotle and Darwin there, but that's a big, big topic. Okay. A good place to start is taking a look at what Charles Darwin, has to say about Aristotle as a biological scientist. In a letter to William Ogle, which I'm going to take a little piece from, William Ogle had done a translation of Aristotle's On the Parts of Animals, a work that I translated about 100 years later, and he admired Charles Darwin greatly, and he sent a gift copy to Charles Darwin when it was published. And Darwin was ill at the time. He would die a few months later. But he had read the introduction to Ogle's translation, and he had also read the first book of Aristotle's Parts of Animals, and probably a good part of the second book as well. And here's part of what he wrote to William Ogle. You must let me thank you for the pleasure which the introduction to the Aristotle book has given me. I've rarely read anything which has interested me more, though I have not read as yet more than a quarter of the book proper. He means the actual translation. From quotations which I had seen, I had a high notion of Aristotle's merits, but I had not the most remote notion what a wonderful man he was. Linnaeus and Cuvier had been my 2 gods, 2 great figures of 18th century biology, though in very different ways, but they were mere schoolboys to old Aristotle. Okay, he was apparently amazed by what he read when he read Aristotle. But here's the thing, he was 2 months away from death when he wrote that. If you look through his notebooks, he kept notebooks about what he should read and what he had read. And in those notebooks, he quite often noted, I should read Aristotle. People keep saying what a great guy Aristotle is. I should read Aristotle. I should read Aristotle. He never reads Aristotle. This reading of the Parts of Animals near his death was the first time he actually had a first-hand knowledge of what Aristotle had accomplished. So, the question of my subtitle is, are they antagonists or are they kindred spirits? They can sound very much like they are kindred spirits. So here's a passage from On the Origin of Species describing the actions of natural selection. Although natural selection can act only through and for the good of each being, notice, yet characters and structures which we are apt to consider as of very trifling importance may thus be acted on. And here's a passage from Aristotle's on the locomotion of animals. Nature makes nothing in vain, but always makes from among the possibilities that which is best for the being of each kind of animal. And to interpret this passage so that it's really kindred in spirit to what Darwin is saying, you have to take the word nature here as I do. This is not a reference to some Dame Nature overseeing all of the natural world. This is a reference to the natures of the particular kinds of animals that he's talking about. Okay. Nevertheless, there is a myth that's been promulgated both by philosophers of science and by historians of science and by biological scientists themselves that these two ways of thinking about living things are entirely antagonistic to one another. So I'm going to outline the myth here, and then I'm going to tell you a few things about the people that promulgated the myth. In order for this myth to get off the ground, one thing you have to do is assume that Aristotle is a sort of reformed Platonist. Rather than having a view of the natural world that's entirely antagonistic to Plato, you have to view him as a kind of reformed Platonist. In what sense a reformed Platonist? Well, remember that Plato's theory of forms argues that true knowledge is of eternal and changeless types in another realm, and that things in this world are only imperfect copies or images of things in that perfect realm of forms. On this view of Aristotle as a reformed Platonist, Aristotelian forms, he talks about natural things as being unities of form and matter, are just Platonic forms embedded in matter. And perhaps it's because of the embeddedness in matter that they're imperfect. That if you could just separate the form away from the matter, they'd be just fine. On that understanding of Aristotle, all perfect members of a species have an identical essence, or specific form, if you like. Variations within species are viewed as deviations from perfection and unnatural. And as with Plato, true knowledge is of the form, and that takes the form of a definition of the essence of the thing. And those essences are unchanging and eternal. And when you look at the way animals reproduce, what they're supposed to be doing on this way of understanding Aristotle is passing on that eternal perfect form of the species from one generation to the next. Okay, so that's what I'll call myth number one. It's a myth about Aristotle, if you like. But there's a second myth that's really important to this talk that I'm giving. And that is that it was this Aristotle that was the biological paradigm that Darwin had to overthrow. That this was the enemy that Darwin was worried about, if you like. The philosophical origins of this myth, you can trace many people in the next generation that kept this myth going, if you like. But this is the philosophical origins, as far as I can tell. Is Mike Massa here? No? He gave a talk on Sunday about this gentleman. Does anybody know who this is? Popper, exactly. Sir Karl Popper, who wrote the following words in The Open Society and Its Enemies. Every discipline, so long as it uses the Aristotelian method of definition, has remained arrested in a state of empty verbiage and barren scholasticism, and the degree to which various sciences have been able to make any progress depended on the degree to which they have been able to get rid of the essentialist method. And when you see the way he presents Aristotle in The Open Society and Its Enemies, he does present Aristotle as essentially just a slightly reformed Platonist. But there are also biological people in biology that are promulgating the same point of view. And both of these people, Popper comes from Austria in the 1930s, Ernst Mayr comes from Germany in the 1930s, and he writes, owing to its belief in essences, this philosophy, the philosophy he's attacking, is also referred to as essentialism, and its representatives as essentialists. And then he puts in parentheses typologists, people who believe in the reality of types. They were influenced by the idealist philosophies of Plato and the modifications of it by Aristotle. The concept of unchanging essences and of complete discontinuities between every eidos, that's Aristotle's word for form or species, and he then puts in parentheses type to go along with typology, and all others makes genuine evolutionary thinking well nigh impossible, he says. Now, in fairness to Ernst Mayr, partly because of discussions with my dear and departed friend Alan Godhelf, partly with discussions with me, we put him on to the writings of somebody who mentored both of us, David Bohm. And when he came to writing a history of biology in 1982, he changed his tune considerably about Aristotle. But this is the view that most people, this is the Ernst Mayr view of Aristotle that most people are familiar with. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about the attitude towards differences and variations within organic populations in Aristotle and Darwin. So I want to say something about the general attitude among philosophers of biology and biologists about what Aristotle thinks about variations in populations. Very important idea for evolutionary biology, obviously. So this is Elliot Sober, philosopher of biology, a very prominent philosopher of biology. And this is what he says. Aristotle is typical of exponents of the natural state model. So what does that natural state model amount to? It holds that variation is introduced into a population by virtue of interference with normal sexual reproduction. The essentialist attempts to understand variation within a species as arising through a process of deviation from type. So perfect reproduction is going to pass on that eternal and changeless essence from one generation to the next. That doesn't always happen. On this view of Aristotle, that's because there's something interfering with the natural inheritance process. Okay, it says evolutionary process. Evolutionary biology gets rid of that whole idea. We don't need essences anymore. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to first of all dismantle the myth, if you like. I want to provide an account of Aristotle's essentialism as you actually find it in his philosophy of biology and in his biological practice. And then I want to take a look at the way biology was being practiced in the 19th century when Darwin was first being educated and going on the Beagle voyage, which I talked about a couple of years ago at OCON. And what you're going to find is that he is up against something. He does have to overcome something, but it's not Aristotelianism that he has to overcome, and that's what we're going to see. And after I've done that, the end of the talk, we'll come back and reconsider the relationship between these two giants of the history of biology, Aristotle and Darwin. Before I get into Aristotle, there is a question that maybe some of you already have in mind. And it's a question that I think is important for you to take what I'm saying seriously. It's the question of, why should you care? After all, these guys lived 2,300 years apart. Evolutionary biology has dominated the biological sciences for, well over 150 years at this point. Why should we care? Okay, well, I hope this will motivate you. On a broadly Aristotelian understanding of scientific inquiry, and I take it that objectivism's approach to scientific inquiry falls within that general realm, a principal aim of science is to discover the essential natures of the entities that you're studying in a particular domain of science, and use that knowledge of the essential natures of things to explain the attributes and actions of the things in that domain. And it doesn't matter whether it's particle physics or molecular biology or psychology. That's on a broadly Aristotelian understanding of the nature of science. That's what science is all about. If this myth were right, it would force you to make a choice. Do you accept that broadly Aristotelian way of understanding the nature of scientific inquiry? And if so, adios evolution. On the other hand, if you're convinced, as I am, as any right-thinking person should be, that evolutionary biology is confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt and is absolutely central to the biological sciences, then maybe it's adios the Aristotelian approach to science and to scientific inquiry. What I am saying is you don't have to make that choice. There is no incompatibility between those two things. All right, so step one is to get into what Aristotle really says about biological inquiry. And in part, I'm going to show you that by showing you how he actually goes about biological inquiry. And I can teach more than one graduate seminar on this topic. So this is going to be very fast, and it's going to be, by my own lights, a rather toy presentation of Aristotle's approach to biology, but it'll be enough for you to get the general idea. I'm going to argue that there are sort of three steps in an Aristotelian inquiry, and I'll give you just a little introduction to each step. The first step is identifying what, in my own work, I call entry-level kinds. So here's what he says philosophically about these entry-level kinds. In those cases where people refer to kinds in a clearly defined manner, and where the kinds have, first of all, a single common nature, and secondly, forms within that common nature not too distinct from each other, we should refer to these animals in common as a single kind, as we do with the birds and the fish. And we should do the same with any other currently unnamed group that embraces, as these kinds do, many forms within it. So what's he saying here? This chapter of the parts of animals, I've argued many times, presents a normative account of how to identify scientifically important kinds that should be investigated by the biological sciences. We should, he says here, follow the same procedure that people have at least implicitly done in identifying birds and fish as a single kind. What does that mean? We should look for many forms that aren't too different from one another. And the many's important. And we should look for evidence of a shared common nature among these many forms that don't look too different from one another. And finally, it's important to give them a name as a single kind, as a unit, if you like. And Aristotle is critical of classifications that violate these principles, and he's particularly thinking of kinds that Plato has identified a couple of times in his writing, especially in the Sophist. He says, think about flyers versus swimmers. Is that a good way to classify living things? Well, he says no, because when you think about it, think about flyers. Bats are flyers. Certain kinds of insects with wings are flyers. Mammals are flyers, right? Mammals. Even, it's not just birds. Says, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is with birds, you can see that they have all kinds of characteristics that are the same. The way they fly, they have feathers, they have beaks, they have 2 legs, they have all these properties that make all the birds. It's reasonable to identify a kind, to include all of those. But what about flyers? No. What do bats and beetles have in common? What do birds have in common with beetles? Similarly with swimmers. Penguins swim. Porpoises, marine mammals, swim. Fish swim. But other than that, what do they all have in common? Very, very little. But what kinds is he thinking about then? Well, he's mentioned birds and fish, and I've already used them as an example of having many forms that are similar within a kind. But how do we identify these groups that are unified in the way Darwin is talking about? Well, that takes us to the second step in our 3-step program. In the same chapter of On the Parts of Animals, he says the following. It's by finding groups where the figures of the parts and of the whole body bear a likeness that kinds have been demarcated. For example, he mentions bird and fish again, but then he mentions kinds that people haven't actually identified by a proper name in Greek thought. But he says it's the same principle. The soft-bodied animals, by which he's referring to what we would call cephalopods, squids, octopuses, and so on. And the hard-shelled animals, by which, when you read him, you find out what he means is the mollusks. For their parts are not merely analogous, he says, to one another, as bone in mankind is analogous to fish spine in fish, but rather their parts are of the same kind and differ only by being larger and smaller, softer or harder, smoother or rougher, and so on. Speaking generally, he says, they vary only by the more and the less. They vary continuously along all kinds of different axes of differentiation. So what you do is you look for forms of the same parts that vary in this continuous way. Think in birds of beaks and feathers. And you look for forms that have the same general body plan. And that way of thinking has come back recently with evolutionary developmental biology. They often use the phrase bow plan, in fact, to talk about the common body plan of animals that are in these large groups. So to concretize that for you, just think about feathers. Think about the incredible variety there are. But it's quite easy to identify all of these things as feathers and to identify what they have in common that varies in this more and less way, in this continuous way, that nevertheless makes them all feathers. So what Aristotle ends up doing is identifying kinds that are remarkably parallel to the kinds that you would all use in thinking about the living world at this very general level. Here are his kinds. He first of all divides animals into what he calls blooded and bloodless, which maps almost perfectly onto our vertebrate-invertebrate distinction. So what are the blooded ones? Cetacea, that is what we would call aquatic mammals. Four-legged live-bearing animals, all of the land mammals except for us. Birds and fish. The bloodless kinds, soft-shelled animals are crustacea. Hard-shelled animals are mollusks. Soft-bodied, which I've highlighted because I'm going to use them as an example of Aristotle's work in practice so that you can concretize what he's talking about. And insects. And if you think about our kinds, they map pretty nicely onto Aristotle's kinds. We tend to think of cephalopods as a kind of mollusk that's lost its hard shell. It's interesting that when you read Aristotle on those two kinds, he talks about if you took the shells off of hard-shelled animals and looked at what's inside, it looks very similar to cephalopods. It looks very similar to what Aristotle calls the softies. All right, so I want to concretize this set of ideas that I've been presenting to you in a fairly abstract way. And I'm going to focus on the group we know as cephalopods. Aristotle just calls them the Malachia, the softies. When I translated as soft-bodied animals because translating it softies is just a little bit too cute for me. But what's common to all of these animals and what's distinctive to some of them? Well, here's what he says right at the beginning of his discussion of the cephalopods. Among the animals called soft bodies, these are the external parts. The so-called feet, he's thinking of the 8 arms. The head, which is continuous with the feet, and he points that out because he's going to go on and say, most people make a mistake there because of where the head is. It's not where people think a head should be. It shouldn't be attached to the legs, you know. The head, continuous with the feet. The sac, containing the internal organs, which some mistakenly call the head because it's what they think is where the head should be. The fin, which encircles the sac. And in all of the soft-bodied animals, the head turns out to be between the feet and belly. So he's really focusing on that weird difference in their overall body plan. Moreover, all have 8 feet. And all of these, he uses the word for feet, but of course what he has in mind is what we would call, I guess, arms if it were an octopus. And all have 2 rows of suckers on those arms, except for one kind of octopus. And then he talks about some other cephalopods. The cuttlefish and the large and small squids have a distinctive feature. In addition to these 8 arms, they have 2 long tentacles, the ends of which are rough, and they have 2 rows of suckers, by which they capture food and convey it to their mouth and fasten themselves to a rock when it storms like an anchor. And I've seen lots of pictures of them capturing food with these tentacles, but I didn't have any reason to think Aristotle was right about this anchoring activity during storms that he talks about until I gave a lecture on this topic and used this example in Germany some years ago. And at the end, in the Q&A, somebody put up their hand and said, yes. And he said, I've seen that. I'm from Croatia, and I scuba dive in the Mediterranean, and I've seen them doing that on stormy days. So only anecdotal, but maybe he's right about that. He got a lot of information from sponge divers about what was going on in the ocean, so they may well have seen this. Okay, so we were talking about those more or less continuous differences between the parts of animals within these unified kinds that Aristotle talks about. So I want you to just look at these pictures. These are all cephalopods of various kinds. And if you just look at them, they look very, very different from one another. But now if you contrast them with another group, Aristotle's Malacostraca, which are what I translate as soft-shelled animals. We would think of them as crustaceans. You can't really see any significant similarity between anything in this group and anything in the cephalopod group. And what Aristotle does is notice that how much difference there is here. The differences are in size, in maybe what they use their claws for. Some of them, the appendages are used for arms in some cases, and in other cases used for some other purpose. But when you compare all of these with one another, they look very different. When you compare them with one of his other big kinds, like fish or birds or cephalopods or porpoises, these all have a kind of unity that you can see. And he wants to argue that within these kinds, there's this more and less continuous variation among the species within the kind. And that's what he wants you to grasp. Okay, so that takes us to step 3 of his procedure of thinking about living things that I want to talk about. And that's the move to definition and causal explanation. The move to figuring out the essential nature of these organisms and using that knowledge to explain the way they behave and the attributes that they have. I want to start by indicating that there's actually no Greek word, single word, that translates as essence. And I want to just tell you a few of the ideas that Aristotle's translators often translate as essence. And it's quite, I think, problematic to translate all of these terms by the same word. And sometimes they'll even translate some of them by the same word within the same paragraph. The first one is ousia. A literal translation might be beingness. All of these expressions, you'll see, are based on the idea of being, the verb to be. Another one that's often translated essence is toti esti, which is literally the what is it. Aristotle has this habit of taking a question and nominalizing it and using it as a noun expression, if you like. And you can see why people don't want to translate these things literally. I mean, it would sound very weird, right? But to translate them all as essence is not just weird, it's misleading. The next one, tautianenai, might be literally translated the being what it is. So it's like, it's not just a descriptive account of what the thing is, but it's getting at the very being of what the thing is. And Aristotle will sometimes use the infinitive of the verb to be, with again a definite article, to characterize the being of a particular kind of thing. So in this case, the being for bird. I think it's important to see that because of the way in which the word essence gets used in the history of philosophy. It's very important to see that Aristotle is really talking about getting at the nature of a thing, getting at its being. That's the basic idea. And in Aristotle's way of thinking, which I think is fundamentally correct, getting at the what of something, getting at its nature, getting at what it is very closely connected to getting at the why about that thing, to getting at the answers to the questions you have about it. So if you think about his 4 causes, everybody, I think, that's had an introduction to Aristotle knows that Aristotle has this view of 4 causes. Each of them is an answer to a particular kind of question. So the so-called material cause is an answer to the question, out of what is something made? Out of what is it constituted? The efficient cause is an answer, particularly when you're talking about the way something is changing or moving. It's an answer to the question, what started the change? What initiated that change? The so-called formal cause is an answer to the question that we've just been talking about, what sort of being is this? What's its nature? And the so-called final cause, the reference to the goals and functions of things, is an answer to the question, what is it for? And we'll see Aristotle going through this in a concrete case in just a minute. It's important to know, in the case of animals, and it's also true of artifacts, that the answers to the third and fourth questions, third and fourth kinds of inquiry, are very closely connected. So if you want to give an account of the being of a heart or a liver, for example, well, if you go from one animal to a next, the material differences, and maybe even the way in which they develop in various kinds of animals, is radically different. They don't look the same. They don't have the same number of chambers. If we're talking about a heart, they come to be differently. They're in different locations. But what's fundamental to a heart, that makes it a heart, is what it does physiologically, what it's for. What's the purpose of the heart in an organism? That will be the same for all the hearts, however materially different they are, however differently they develop, how differently they are in size and place, and so on. Okay, on the Aristotelian understanding of the relationship between those two inquiries, a scientific definition turns out to be just a disguised causal explanation, and he gives an example in the posterior analytics to illustrate this. It's a toy example. I think this is actually the way he understands thunder, but here's how the example goes. There's a difference between saying why it thunders, what the causal account of thunder is, and what thunder is. In the former case, you'll answer it this way, because the fire in the clouds was quenched. But to answer the question, what is thunder, the what is it question, you'll say, it's a noise of fire being quenched in the clouds. Now notice, exactly the same words are being used here. And so he goes on, he says, the same account is given in a different way. In one case, it's a continuous demonstration, that is, it's a causal explanation of thunder, and in the other case, it's the definition that tells you what thunder fundamentally is. So there's a very tight connection between giving a definition of something and giving a causal explanation that reveals that thing. And in practice, in the parts of animals, you see this over and over and over again. I'll just give you one example, but there are many. This is in the chapter on the heart, on the parts of animals. And this is at the conclusion. It's a very long chapter. He's been telling you all kinds of things about how hearts are different in all kinds of different animals, and what the heart, on his understanding, what the heart does and how it's related to the other organs and so on. And he concludes in the following way. Regarding the heart then, what sort of thing it is, the answer to the what is it question about a heart, what it's for the sake of, answering the question what is it for, the final causal question, and, or perhaps i.e., the same Greek word can mean either, the cause owing to which it is present in all those animals that have a heart. Let so much be said. So he's saying, this is how he's summing up what he's done in that chapter. He's given you both an account of what the heart is and an account of why animals that have hearts have hearts. He's given you both a what is it answer and a causal explanation for why the hearts are present in animals. Okay, so 2 examples going back to the cephalopods for you to again concretize some of these ideas. You'll recall that in his discussion of the cephalopods in the Historia Animalium, he said there was one kind of octopus that was different from all the others. It only had 1 row of suckers on its 8 arms instead of 2. All the others have 2. So the question comes up when you're searching for a causal explanation, why? Well, it turns out Aristotle tells you why in On the Parts of Animals, which is a treatise that tries to give you the causes of all of the parts. Here's what he says. While the other octopuses have 2 rows of sucker, one kind has a single row. This is because of the length and thinness of their nature. For it's necessary that the narrow arms of this particular kind of octopus have a single row of suckers. It's not then because it's best that they have this feature, but because it's necessary owing to the distinctive account of their being. So what he's saying is there's something essential about this kind of octopus that necessitates that it have only a single row of suckers, and in particular, it's how thin the arms are. Now, when you think about that as an example, you have to think about, well, couldn't it have 2 really small suckers on the arm? So I'm imagining, but Aristotle doesn't tell us this, that he's thinking you get down to a certain size and the sucker simply wouldn't be functional anymore. It has to be of a certain size to actually perform its function. And having 2 really, really small ones simply wouldn't do the job, whereas having 1 that's appropriate in size will do the job. But what's interesting about this is he doesn't say it's because there's some value or function in its having 1 row rather than 2. He just says it's necessitated by the shape of the arm of this particular kind of octopus. And there it is. And here's what is said on a website about this particular kind of octopus. Sounds just like Aristotle. Its tentacles only provided with a single row of suckers, while the common octopus has 2 rows of suckers on each arm. In case you were wondering whether Aristotle was right about this. Now, second example. Remember those cuttlefish? They have 8 arms too, just like the octopuses do, but they also have these 2 extra tentacles. And you might ask, why? The octopuses don't. Why do the squids and the cuttlefish have this property? Well, again, Parts of Animals, same chapter, Aristotle gives you the answer. Since the cuttlefish and squid have short legs that are useless both for taking hold of rocks and for feeding, they have 2 long tentacles by which they moor themselves and by which they hunt down prey. The octopuses don't need these because their arms are perfectly suitable for this purpose. And modern textbooks say essentially exactly the same thing. And there's a picture taken from the internet of, you'll notice they peeled back the 8 arms, which are useless for capturing prey, and out come the tentacles to capture the fish. And again, the description sounds very much like Aristotle. Okay, one final thing. What about Aristotle's attitude towards individual variations within populations of animals? What does he think about that? Are they really unnatural deviations? Well, this is a passage from his account of inheritance in the generation of animals, another one of his biological treatises, perhaps his most sophisticated of all. Here's what he says. In relationship to the generation, the distinctive and particular features are always stronger. And for time, I'll just focus on the passages that I've highlighted. Both particular and kind generate, but more so the particular, for this is the being of the animal. And what is coming to be is, while a certain sort of animal, also this animal here, this particular animal. And then he gives an example at the end. He's thinking of generation as passing on capacities for movement, that those movements of which are coordinated, and they're what lead to the production of the next animals in the next generation. And he says all such powers, potentially even from ancestors, but more from those closer to one of the particulars. And by particular, I mean Coriscus or Socrates. So what he's saying here, as I read him, is that specific and generic characteristics, the general characteristics, are passed on along with the dominant motions that the individual parents are passing on in generation. So what that means is, while of course it's Socrates' particular nose that the movements are going to be representing in reproduction, if you create Socrates' bulbous nose, it's going to be a human nose. It's also going to be an animal nose. How could it not be the case that that's true? But he's stressing that it's the particular characteristics that are primary because they represent the being of the animal, he says. So they're not deviations. They're not unnatural. They are the most natural traits that are being passed on. All right, so let me sum up. Aristotle's not, as Ernst Mayr might put it, a typological essentialist. He's what I would call an explanatory essentialist. He considers variation within and between kinds to be natural and important. It's how you get a handle on what things actually are. The individual variations are most real. General similarity is a consequence of those being passed on. So, biological research progresses through three empirically driven stages that I've discussed: a grasp of the general entry-level kinds, a study of the continuous more and less variations within kinds, and finally an investigation into the causal relationships among the characters of those kinds to figure out which ones are causally basic and responsible for the others. And finally, causally basic features might be functional and teleological, but they also, in the case of that we saw of the Helidona octopus, it might be simply structural. All right, so what was Darwin really up against, if I'm right, and he wasn't up against Aristotelian essentialism, at least not the kind that the myth? Well, Charles Lyell was one of Darwin's real heroes. Darwin was reading Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology while he was on the Beagle voyage, as I talked about a couple of years ago, and was absolutely bowled over by it. Well, here's what Charles Lyell says in Volume 2 of the Principles of Geology about this very question. The majority of naturalists agree with Linnaeus that all individuals propagated from one stock have certain distinguishing characteristics in common which will never vary and which have remained the same since the creation of each species. And in a review of Darwin's On the Origin of Species, William Hopkins writes, "Every natural species must, by definition, have had a separate and independent origin, so that all theories which assert the derivation of all classes of animals from one origin do, in fact, deny the existence of natural species at all." This is what Darwin's up against. I would like to call it species creationism. It's the idea that all species are created at one time, and they're built, have a species essence built into them, and there's limits on how much variation there can be because of that species essence that's given to them at the time of creation. So these thinkers really do think that any variation from type is in fact unnatural. So what Darwin is up against is he needs to make space for the kind of speciation that he is sure has to have taken place. Different species must be able to be originated by a process that begins with a group of organisms with many heritable differences. So there has to be lots of variation within a population, and he's sure there is. Through the actions of natural selections, you get subgroups produced that are different enough to be considered different varieties of the same species. And if that process should go on long enough, on Darwin's understanding, you will have organisms that are different enough that you'll want to give them distinct names, species names, and treat them as distinct species. So what does Darwin say about this term species? I'll go through this pretty quickly, but it's important, I think, to know what he has in mind. Here he's saying that the term species is given, as he says, for the sake of convenience to a set of individuals that closely resemble each other. And the term variety is just given to groups that are less distinct and more fluctuating. There's another passage that says pretty much the same thing in the conclusion. I think this is a really important passage. It's in the conclusion of The Origin, and he's talking to future biologists. He's trying to tell you, here's what you can expect if you accept my views. He says, systematists will be able to pursue their labors just as they do now, but they will not be incessantly haunted by the shadowy doubt whether this or that group is a species. What they need to do is decide whether any form is sufficiently constant and distinct from other forms to be capable of definition. Constant and distinct. Whether the differences are sufficiently important to deserve a specific name. Okay, so I think the following points are really important to keep in mind. First of all, he's not talking about terms like chimpanzee and tiger and octopus. He's talking about the term species and criteria for determining when that term should be applied to a group, all right? That's what he has in mind. And he's saying that there are two kinds of variation that you have to pay special attention to. First is how constant is the kind. What he means by that is there constant deviation and fluctuation within it? Has it become a stable enough thing that you can treat it as a species and study it carefully? And the other thing he's asking is how much does it resemble other members of other groups of organisms within the same genus or family? And he says that's all you'll have to do is just decide how much constancy there is and how much fluctuation or deviation and variation there is. So as I see it, he's telling you to focus on the degree of constancy and difference in deciding whether you've got something that you should refer to as a new species or not. He doesn't have any skepticism about there being an appropriate time to invent a name for a new species and study it as a distinct species. And he's saying you have to give higher value than you might currently do to these more and less differences between forms. One of the primary differences between Darwin and Aristotle, I think, is that Aristotle thought that once you get down below functional differences, where it really makes a difference to the life of the organism, you don't have to worry about the variation very much as a biologist. Whereas Darwin is very focused on the fact that very tiny, small differences within a population might actually make an important difference to the organism and determine whether it is at an advantage for both survival and reproduction or not. And here's just a concretization. Darwin was a pigeon breeder, and he actually raised them, I think, partly just to learn how breeders create new varieties. So here are a bunch of pigeons created as different varieties. And if any of you have looked at Darwin's finches, ornithologists in the 19th century told Darwin those are distinct species. But they are so similar that Darwin didn't even think to collect them as if they were distinct species. He just threw them all in the same box and couldn't remember which islands they came from and so on. And the ornithologist said, oh, that's too bad because these are actually distinct species. So it would be important to know, would they come from different islands and so on? I didn't know. But Darwin is saying that if these pigeons that we all know stemmed from a single stock a few hundred years previously when breeders started producing these breeds, says they might be, if shown to an ornithologist and he were told that they were wild birds, would rank them as well-defined species because they're radically different from one another. So Darwin is making the point that whether you rank something as a species or as a variety is to some extent based on knowledge you have about the history of that organism, but also is based on how much difference there is there. And Darwin thinks these would well be ranked as species if they were found in the natural world because they're constant, they pass on their traits in a very reliable way, and they're very, very different from one another. All right, so what common ground is there? And I'm wrapping up now, in case you're wondering. First of all, explaining the subtle differences between forms of a kind is a shared goal. Explaining those differences will often appeal to the value of those differences for the organism that's under study. Both of them believe that. Differences among forms of a kind will resolve into continuous variations along many dimensions. Neither of them consider taxonomic ranking is written into the world by a creator god, the way most of Darwin's critics believed. Both of them think that the way we classify organisms should be tied to our explanatory goals. And there's no real fundamental conflict between having an Aristotelian approach to the philosophy of biology and evolution. But they are indeed worlds and millennia apart. And in the 18th century, there was an explosion of knowledge, starting actually in the 16th century, but by the 18th century, an absolute explosion in knowledge of fossil sequences all over the world, and a realization that as those fossil sequences get closer to the surface, the fossilized organisms are more and more like the organisms that are in the same location today. There's a parallel explosion in knowledge of species worldwide and how they are bioregionally different from one another. So the Australian mammals are all marsupials. Is that because Australia is a particularly great place for marsupials and the placentals can't live there? No, actually, you put placentals in Australia, they overrun the marsupials really quickly. So why are there marsupials there? And why are the animals in the Galapagos Islands so much like the animals in South America? And why are the animals on Madagascar so much like the animals on Africa? This is the kinds of questions that are just whirling around in the 18th century. And so it's no surprise that Linnaeus is trying to figure out a classification method that can expand indefinitely because he's realizing we're going to know more and more and more species, and we're going to have to figure out a way to classify them that's not limited to the animals we know now. And we need explanations for those patterns in the fossil record and in biogeographic distribution. So it's no surprise that by the end of the 18th century, we have all these peoples I've named up here, including Charles Darwin's grandfather, coming up with theories of evolution to account for these phenomena. It's the obvious answer. So, back to the last 2 months of Charles Darwin's life. He's reading William Ogle's translation of On the Parts of Animals. As we know, he writes to Ogle, praising Aristotle. And I wanted to share with you Ogle's reply. This is a week before Charles Darwin dies. Exactly a week before he dies. Thank you for your kind and eulogistic letter, re the parts of animals. It gave me much pleasure. You remember his remark about Linnaeus and Cuvier, but Aristotle they were mere schoolboys to old Aristotle. I'm glad to have added a third person to your God and completed the Trinity. It's kind of overwhelming for me to think that in the last 2 months of his life, Darwin was reading Aristotle. Here's my two great heroes in the history of biology. And Darwin's reading Aristotle and being dumbfounded by what he's reading, amazed by what he's reading. I'm hoping that in all of the pain he was suffering in those months, he was bedridden the whole time, reading Aristotle was one of the things that actually gave him pleasure and joy. And I'd like to think that he was still well enough to read this from Ogle and have a really good chuckle about it. He died April 19th. I'd like to leave you with the titles of 4 papers. I can pass these on to anybody that's interested. Just send me an email. My dear friend Alan Godhelf wrote a wonderful paper on the correspondence between Ogle and Darwin called Darwin on Aristotle in the Journal of the History of Biology. It's also in his collected papers. You want to find out more what I think about Aristotle's philosophy of biology, you can help me with some honorariums. And finally, this guy would like to thank you very much.
Hi,
Yeah, hi.
Thank you for the lecture. I wanted to
Welcome.
ask a question about one of the slides where I think Aristotle said that it's not about the one row of suckers.
Right.
It's not the best, it's just what's necessary.
Right.
What did he mean? I don't really grasp it.
Okay. A little bit of context. Many of his explanations in his biology are final causal explanations. That is, they refer to the function or goal of the part, what the part is good for, how it helps the organism. What he's saying there is that I'm not giving that kind of an explanation in this case. In this case, if it were possible to have 2 functional suckers on the one arm, that might be best. But in this case, because of how thin the arm is, that's not possible. So he's basically saying, I can't give you a teleological or final causal explanation for this part. It's not there because it's better for this organism to have 1 rather than 2. It's just a requirement of the structure of the organism. Does that help?
I see what you mean, but then I must ask Aristotle, like, best according to what standard? Because if...
according to what the suckers are actually for, and he knows that, they're for capturing prey and for anchoring themselves when they need to avoid being buffeted around by storms. So he knows there's a purpose for the suckers. But why is it that this one kind, he's trying to explain the difference. Why is it that this one kind has only 1 row, whereas all the others have 2? He's trying to explain the difference. And he says it's not because it's actually better. There's not some way in which it's better for this particular kind of octopus to have one rather than two. And I gave you a speculation of my part. Aristotle doesn't do this, but my speculation is he's thinking that if there was actually two rows on that very thin arm, they wouldn't actually be functional at all.
So then it is best that it has one row. Like,
well,
I don't...
you raise a very good point, because sometimes if you sort of narrow in the context and you ask yourself, well, again, you have to kind of speculate about this because Aristotle doesn't really tell you. But if you narrow in the context and you're asking about that particular organism, you might say for that particular organism, it's functional, it serves a purpose. So I think he is trying to think in a wider context of why is it that all the others have two, and wouldn't it be better if this one had two? But then you have to speculate about why he thinks it can't have two and can only have one.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question regarding the contemporary discourse around Aristotle's ethics. So speaking of kindred spirits, it is not uncommon to encounter a perspective that there is a kindred, it is not uncommon to hear that Aristotle, for him, virtue was, like, one of the descriptions of virtue is that it is an end in itself, alongside being like end towards eudaimonia. And we have another guy who says that ethics or virtue is an end in itself, namely Kant, obviously in another way. But it is pretty common to see them being presented as, kindred spirits in that regard. It seems to me that something has went terribly wrong, and I have heard that it wasn't always the case that Aristotle was presented as sort of Kant's ethical grandpa. So I would love to hear some insight of yours into that, if you have any. I imagine you do.
This is not an area that I'm a specialist in, so I'm sure there are people actually in this room who could answer that question better than I can, because I don't specialize in moral philosophy, first of all, and I don't specialize in Aristotle's moral philosophy in particular. But I do think that, and especially when you're comparing Aristotle and Kant, I'm not really the right person to ask that question about. But I do know that for contemporary virtue theorists, say like Philippa Foot, or people that have been influenced by Philippa Foot's writing, there is a kind of biological, a thinking that there's a kind of biological basis to what is, to the use of normative language in ethics and to describing certain behaviors as good or evil and so on and so forth, and thinking of that on analogy with the way we use that language to describe other organisms, even plants. So, it's very common, even among objectivists, to translate eudaimonia as flourishing. And Philippa Foot says, yeah, that's the language we talk about when a plant is doing really, really well, but we should talk about human goodness in kind of the same kind of way. And whatever similarities or differences there might be between Aristotle and Kant on this issue, I don't think Kant would ever make a claim like that. And I also think that, again, I don't know Kant all that well, but I think he's not thinking of, he's thinking of man as an end in itself. And I don't think he's thinking about every individual thinking of their own life as an end in itself. And that's a pretty radical difference, I think. Beyond that, I can't go because it's not. I feel a little bit out of my depth when I'm talking about that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hey James, thanks for the talk. Just a quick comment and a question about the previous question Itamar asked about the variations with the suckers.
Yeah.
You can say that variation. I mean, I think evolution in general, like, it doesn't have to have a purpose, right? So, like, one can have one row of suckers, whether it's better or not for that organism, it just is. Is that? I don't know if you have a quick comment on that.
Yeah. So I mean, that's absolutely right from an evolutionary perspective. While I mean, there's a debate within evolutionary biology about how much explanation should depend on adaptation and selection pressure and so on. It's certainly the case that it's a more and less thing because there are cases where traits get fixed in a population that are fixed there for reasons other than adaptation.
Yep.
But you can't use that to help Aristotle out, I don't think, obviously. But it's pretty clear. Aristotle thinks that it's part of the defining nature of that particular Helidone octopus that it's very, very narrow structurally. He's not trying to explain that. He thinks that's basic knowledge about that creature. That's what it is to be that kind of an octopus. And given that structure, this is what's available to it.
It's a manifestation of it.
So I think what he's saying is the more fundamental basic fact is the structural fact about this kind of organism. And that's what's explaining the one row of suckers. It's not fundamentally explanatory that the suckers perform better given the nature of that kind of animal. It's starting from, this is the nature of that kind of animal, and that's why it has those single rows of suckers.
But to my actual question, that was just a quick comment. At what point does it become sort of settled science in a sense of, you know, the Earth is flat, right? It's not an unsettled science anymore, right? Certain scientific. So is this a real debate? Is evolution still, like, it seems like is it settled yet? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, or is this debate between?
I would say, and you know, I talk to a lot of biologists and a lot of philosophers of biology on a pretty regular basis. And I would say the view that Ernst Mayr expresses in that quotation is still the default view among biologists and evolutionary biologists. I will say that since evolutionary developmental biology has come along, there's a revival of, there's one of the papers that I put on the final page was a paper by Dennis Walsh called Evolutionary Essentialism. There's more and more people saying there's no incompatibility between talking about essentialism and talking about evolutionary biology. So I think that is fading away gradually. But if you were to ask people about Aristotle versus contemporary biology, I think the default view would be, oh, well, you know, it would sound like a sort of scholastic, Platonized Aristotle that they're talking about. And it's people that, you know, for the most part, have never read Aristotle's biology. They don't know his approach. Hopefully, there's so much good secondary literature on Aristotle's biology that is full of quotes from him that hopefully this will eventually change. But I still find that this mythic view pretty common.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I've always had good experience with biologists in terms of rationality, objectivity, active-mindedness, focus on inducing principles from observations and so on. But I don't know whether it's like my personal experience because it's not representative or is because of the science itself. I should think that since biology is based on observation and it's essentially inductive and it's quite hard to make stuff up like in mathematics or physics, I would expect biologists to be more objective, inductive, but I don't know much about biology, so I wonder what's your view on that. Do you think that biology is essentially rational methodology, essentially inductive methodology, or maybe there are some schools of thought that override it?
I think in general, I agree with you that the biological sciences, somebody else has said this in one of the other talks this week, biology is healthily inductive to this day. There are people that tend to work in a more theoretical way, but if what they're saying and doing doesn't have any obvious application or any obvious way to confirm it inductively, it's not taken very seriously. So if that's the basic question, I would say, yeah, biology tends to operate in a healthily inductive way, and particularly focused on comparative judgments based on similarity and difference, and a lot of experimentation that's not based on the sort of hypothetical deductive or Popperian model, but it's actually exploratory experimentation that's trying to figure out what's actually going on, probing. And yeah, I think, and in that respect as well, it's more Aristotelian. But one of the problems is a lot of people have a picture of Aristotle as a scientist that doesn't sound very inductive. And one of my goals throughout my research career has been to paint a picture of Aristotle, the great inductivist.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
You talked about some of the problems in translations of Aristotle.
Yeah.
How can the people who are interested in reading Aristotle's literature on biology find good translations?
Okay. Well, at the risk of my translation of the parts of animals is a good translation, and there are dangers of making a translation overly literal. It can become almost unreadable. The way I worked on my translation was to create one of those almost unreadable, really literal translations, and then try it out on people and keep backing away from the literalness until I had something that read like good English, but wasn't very far away from what Aristotle was actually saying. So with ousia, very good example. As I said, if you wanted a kind of literal translation, beingness would be a good, but that's not an English word. Unfortunately, that word has often been translated substance, which is a long way away from the idea that Aristotle has in mind, which is being. So when I decided I had to translate it somehow, I hit on substantial being. So I'm tying it to the old translations by the adjective substantial, but I'm indicating that the word really means being. And that's the kind of thing that you have to make. Now, other translations, Arthur Peck's Loeb translations got better and better as he got older. So his translation of the History of Animals, which was the last thing he did, is pretty reliable. His translation of the Parts of Animals, which he did in the 1940s, is, I found in comparing it with the text and working on the translation myself, pretty unreliable. But on the Parts of Animals, I would say my translation's good. David Bohm, who is the real dean of Aristotelian biology in the 20th century, did a translation of the last 4 books of the History of Animals because Arthur Peck had died. And those 4 books, I think he's a little bit too much on the too literal side, but they're quite reliable because of that. They give you a good mirror of what's going on in the Greek. Beyond that, I can't give you much more guidance.
Thank you.
So Dr. Lennox, you suggested there are other areas where Aristotle was a scientist besides biology that people may have misunderstood. Could you name, I guess, some of those other things? And is there anything in particular that has our view of him been corrupted over the centuries? Besides not reading.
Yeah, sure. It's kind of misleading, but in psychology texts, you'll often see his De Anima cited as sort of a first work in psychology. It's misleading because it's really a book about living things generally. It's a book about the psyche, which it gets translated soul. It's really a principle of life in living things. And he thinks plants have it, in a way, and animals have it, and human beings have it. The third book is focused on particularly human characteristics, the mind, and how the mind works, and so on. So it's kind of misleading to say that it's the first text, but it is a scientific investigation of, what is the principle that is responsible for living activity? What are the capacities of life, and how do they underwrite the activities of living things, and how do different living things have these capacities in different ways, and so on and so forth. Meteorology, obviously. The De Caelo is a work in cosmology, not really astronomy, because Aristotle thought astronomy was a mathematical science. And he makes use of the mathematical results of astronomers, but he always says, the mathematicians say blah about, say, the size of the Earth, or how far away the moon is, or whatever. But there again, it's definitely, he considers it, what he would say is these are all works of physicae episteme, natural knowledge or natural science, as opposed to metaphysics or politics or ethics. So there's quite a wide range of things. But the biology makes up about a quarter of the entire Aristotelian corpus that we have. So far and away, that's what he devoted most of his time and attention to. Is that okay?
And why has, I guess, it's come down to us as the generation of these various myths? Like, what's the source of that? Well, you explain the myths around, Aristotle was an obstacle for Darwin, and maybe he's an obstacle in these other domains of science. Like, what's up with that?
Well, I think the first step is treating Aristotle as a reformed Platonist. I think that's step number one. And that, to some extent, is due to Neoplatonic commentators, but it really gets picked up in the medieval period. So most of the revival of Aristotle is a revival at the hands of Christians who have already been strongly influenced by the Neoplatonists. So the kind of Aristotle that typically gets presented in that period is much more a Platonized version of Aristotle than if you just go back and read him. It doesn't look that way. So I think that's a big reason why. But I think there's also a kind of, in some cases, a kind of animus against Aristotle that's underwriting a lot of this stuff. Yep. Thank you.